Thanks so much for joining me here today on another Conversations with Cabral, where I introduce special guest Brian MacKenzie today. Brian is someone that I've wanted to connect with for quite some time. We run in the same circle. We've never chatted before, but I love his work in all things human performance. He's worked with Olympic athletes, world champions, professional athletes, and many more. One of the reasons why I wanted to have this conversation with Brian today is that he's able to apply a lot of the different research that we've spoken about on this show in the actual real world with real people at the highest level and what we can take from that in our everyday lives. Now, one of the fun things about this show as well is after I was done recording it, I always do my intro, which is where we're going over right now. Well, Brian and I's conversation went deep, deep, deep for those people that like to really get into the nitty gritty of exercise physiology and human performance. We do that. But then we step back, we kind of give you the real world perspective and how to begin to implement it in your life. So one of the things, again, about talking with high performers like Brian is able to go deep and then be able to step back, extract all the information that we just got from him, and then just say, okay, how do we apply this? I think you're really going to enjoy this show. I had so much fun talking with him, a full 90 minutes. Can't wait to have him back on in the future. So after listening to the show or during the show, let us know what you thought. Just head on over to Instagram, search my name, Stephen Cabral. You'll see today's episode. You'll be able to tag Brian and myself. Let us know what you thought and if you have any questions. Take care, everyone, and enjoy the show.
Welcome to the Cabral Concept, where board-certified naturopath and integrative health practitioner Dr. Stephen Cabral shares how he was diagnosed at the age of 17 with a life-altering illness and given no hope for recovery. It was only after studying and traveling all over the world did he discover how to combine ancient Ayurvedic healing practices with state-of-the-art naturopathic and functional medicine to fully rebalance the body and re-energize it with life. It's time to discover how to get well, lose weight, and finally feel alive again. And now, here's your host, Dr. Stephen Cabral.
Brian MacKenzie, welcome to the show. It's great to have you on here today.
Thank you for having me on, Doc. Appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. I always, when I mention your name or your name is mentioned inside of the wellness and fitness-based circles, it's always tough to pin down exactly what you do. I typically know you as the human performance expert. You know, that person likes to take, I would say the practice. You are a true practitioner, but also looks at the research. And that's why I really connect with the work that you're doing, because I read the research every day, but I'm big on how does this implement in the real world? So how would you describe what you do for people?
I would say I'm best described as kind of a specialist with human performance. I look at human performance more from the efficiency standpoint than the capacity standpoint. Mm-hmm. That did not say I don't like capacity.
Yeah, explain that a little bit for people, what that means, because it makes a whole lot of sense, but I want to make sure people understand that.
The world of human performance, or even strength and conditioning, or sport, or however you want to arc it, has been enamored with potential, right? Versus, and that doesn't mean that efficiency doesn't fit there, but everything's looked at it like take, for instance, VO2 max. There's something that has been relatively worn out with very little understanding as to, well, what is VO2 efficiency? Meaning, what if I'm at a 140 heart rate and not as aerobic as I could be? Versus like, hey, my aerobic capacity is 155 heart rate, right? Or how much weight I can actually pick up. There's a capacity issue, right? Like I can deadlift 500 pounds and it's like, awesome. Where does that translate for you? Mm-hmm. What does that translate into for you? Or does that put you into a specialization, right? And there's nothing wrong with any of that. I like it all, but I've been more drawn to nature's side of things. Nature doesn't care. Nature's got one main law. It's called adaptation. Yeah. And it's those of us who can adapt fastest that it plays by. And, you know, there's no equality in anything until the day you're exiting this thing. right? Until that moment you're leaving, meaning dying. And I think that's the trade-off we've made as a species, with comfort, with safety. And I'm not suggesting that we need to go back to being wild animals. But I think we've unlearned a lot of our intuitive perspective or even insight into who we actually are. I feel like our physiology is the most misunderstood thing we have, in that it's communicating to us at all times. And one of the variables that I looked at that really drew me into continuing down this efficiency route was working with professional athletes, world champions, who were dealing with some of the most chronic, basic problems that everybody else in the world was dealing with. Anxiety, depression, just simple things that everybody kind of experiences, especially in today's day and age, being the world's best, right? And what did that mean? How could we help in that aspect? And so that's where I kind of focus in on. So I'm more or less I teach people, including myself, how to respond versus react. Yes. And that is, I think, the crux of my work.
Yeah. And so for a lot of people that aren't familiar with your work, and really what I want to draw out today are how to better adapt in terms of stress in life, because we can't eliminate stress from our life. We can certainly reframe it, how we look at it, but no matter what, life is stressful. The food that we put in our body is a stress in the body. The air that we breathe is a stressor. So digestive issues. So we're going to look at it. How do we get our bodies stronger, essentially? And I read it a little bit differently, how you use the word efficiency versus capacity, meaning that I can do a lot of the same things that you might be able to do and another person might be able to do. But how easy is it for me versus you versus that other person? Because the nature does like efficiency, meaning when we used to look for food back in the day, we weren't running around all day. We were walking slowly and aerobically and making sure that we didn't exhaust ourselves looking for that food, because we would just then need more calories. So, again, my favorite Ayurvedic quote goes back to, and I don't know if you've ever heard this before, but it says, the key to immortality is infinite flexibility. Is just being able to adapt.
Yeah, and flexibility is a favorite word, one of my favorite words, for sure.
It's just metabolic flexibility.
You're spot on. Like, how efficient are we? And that is all that nature cares about. And that's why we'll cut corners with everything, right? That's why technology is so attractive.
Yes.
Is because it feels like it's this efficiency thing. Oh, I get to know. And yet it's like, you realize you could feel that. Most of that can be felt.
And that's what I want to look at today, because what I do a lot of is lab work. So I'm running, I'm running gut work, toxicity, hormones, cortisol throughout the day, looking at an entire 28-day female hormonal cycle to see where estrogen, progesterone fall, all that. But you can't do that all the time. You have to understand your physiology. You need to be able to wake up and say, where am I today versus yesterday? Why am I here? And so it's also, the why is a big one, because sometimes you look at your heart rate variability, you look at anything, you're like, I have no idea why this is all plummeted today. Today wasn't any different, or yesterday wasn't any different than any other day. And here's where I am today. And there's a little bit of mystery involved, but I think we can figure out more of that if we start to look at it at a much more quantifiable level. And that's why I wanted to have you on. I want to get into breath work for sure, but also go beyond that. Because as I spoke about earlier with you, we've had Dr. Jay Wiles on, we've had Patrick McEwen on, we've had James Nestor on. So we know now, my audience knows now a little bit about breathing techniques. And I know your basis of your work is a lot of the breath work. So let's talk about that first and then start to move beyond that.
Certainly. We feel that the foundation of everything is going to be breath, and understanding that, because life itself is based on energy, and every obligate aerobe on this planet, meaning every species that uses oxygen for energy production through cellular respiration, is required to use their breathing 100% of the time with all energy. Now, 90% of that is basically supposed to be aerobically derived, right? From an anaerobic perspective, you're still needing to offload carbon dioxide because it becomes a byproduct, one of the byproducts of either anaerobic or aerobic cellular respiration. That being said, we have the unique ability of controlling the variable of breath, right? At any point that we want. And there are fundamental differences. And I think, James Nestor and McEwen did a great job of really just talking about and bringing to light the difference between, or the importance of, nasal breathing versus mouth breathing. Mm-hmm. That is the most fundamental thing I can look at in terms of breathing, and where to start with breathing is understanding the difference between the two. There's a reason why my arousal state goes up when I'm talking to you. Mm-hmm. I'm breathing through my mouth. I am sending myself into a higher arousal state through this process. There is a physiological consequence for me breathing out of my mouth, but there's a physiological reason for me to engage as I talk, right? But there's also a physiological reason for when I stop talking, that I breathe through my nose. And there are serious things that are going on with inside not only the neurobiology, but even my physiological processes, my nervous system, et cetera, that require my attention to be on you and listening.
Yeah. Can you explain why more of the mouth breathing is activating more of that sympathetic nervous system versus the nasal breathing calming as well for people?
Certainly. The biggest reason is the offloading of carbon dioxide. The simplest aspect of this is the biggest difference between nasal and mouth breathing from a physiological perspective, not an immune system one, would be, even though those are interconnected, would be the fact that I can offload a lot more carbon dioxide via my mouth. Mm-hmm. Yet when I inhale through either anatomical process, I'm not necessarily absorbing any more oxygen from either one. So the shift in pH that occurs out of that, the shift in my ability to use oxygen as a result of that, because there is a dissociative curve. When I say that, that means if you were to look at a yin-yang, right? We've all seen that. Think of one side of it. So think of the yin as oxygen and the yang as carbon dioxide. You cannot get biological value out of oxygen without the presence of carbon dioxide. So if I diminish my carbon dioxide levels in the blood with no metabolic demand for that, right? Meaning my work capacity has not gone up. My cellular respiration has not really gone up in the fact that there's no work demand. So I don't need to offload excess carbon dioxide as a result of more metabolic activity. I am what is necessary. So the necessity becomes carbon dioxide. And so if I am a mouth breather, or I'm breathing out of my mouth, or I'm talking all day, I've more or less shifted that curve, and I've taken myself further away from aerobically functioning efficiently. Mm-hmm. The system does not care, nor does it have, because this is our nature. Our physiology is our nature. Okay. It does not care whether the work demand or whether I have inadvertently huff and puffed out of my mouth. If I've removed the ability to use oxygen cellularly, my cells say no problem. We'll use the other means of carbohydrate. We'll use the other ways of dealing with this. So we start to see more lactate presence. We start to see more of that shift towards higher concentrations of carbohydrate use for energy. Then we start to see that dip towards anaerobic cellular respiration, which becomes glycolytic, right? So this then starts to move. And I'm not saying this all happens at once, but I will say this. We have looked at this under metabolic testing. If I go walk my dog for 10 minutes around the block with my mouth open, and then I decide to go walk my dog for 10 minutes with my mouth shut, you're looking at two different energy systems being used.
What are you using to measure that?
Metabolic cart.
Metabolic cart?
Yeah. So you're looking at gas exchange machine.
Okay. Got it. Oh, you are using that. That's fantastic.
Oh yeah. And we're starting to move this more into so everything with us starts ground floor. We've got the technology, most of the technology and when we start to get inklings of new things popping up, I've got enough friends, as you've met, that are in the scientific world that drag me in and say, hey, let's really look at this, or let's look at this. And so we start to look at that, and that's what we've been able to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think but again, always correct me if I'm wrong here. I use the Leaf device as well, the Leaf Therapeutics, because it's the only one that I really know of yet that can give me true haptic feedback and second-to-second basis based on my heart rate variability. And I bet, for the average person, you'd be able to see the difference mouth open, walking your dog versus mouth closed in terms of age.
Yeah.
Oh, you don't need technology to tell you this at all. You can, like, the problem, the issue will become when we start to feel it become more difficult because we're breathing out of our nose. And this is where the brain comes in. And this is where our relationship to carbon dioxide. See, this is not just a physiological phenomenon. This is actually a relational one. And every human being, every animal that uses oxygen, like I've stated earlier, is set up with what's called the suffocation alarm system. And that is tied into how you perceive carbon dioxide. And at some point along the line, CO2 levels getting too high or us becoming too acidic, that's where the pH starts to shift. Our chemoreceptors are setting off haywire mechanisms in the brainstem that are saying, breathe, dude, breathe. And this is where the idea of I'm running out of air, or I don't have enough oxygen comes in, when in fact, that probably couldn't be further from the truth. You just have an exorbitant, you have an excess amount of CO2 that you're not used to that's kicking in. And this varies from person to person, depending on what we've seen on how we manage stress in different situations. So, Stephen, you handle stress very differently than I do, but there's a lot of similarities in how we handle stress as well. And so certain aspects of that start to pick up, but it becomes a relationship because our chemoreceptors are largely set up in the aortic and the carotid arteries, which tells me from an arterial standpoint, this is an outward bound system. So it's a predictive system that the detection system in the brainstem is using to predict where that shift is happening. It's not what happened. So if it was in the venous system, it'd be too late, right? And we'd have deoxygenated blood. We'd have higher levels of CO2 because that's what's coming out in the venous system and what I inevitably end up expelling or exhaling, right?
Yes.
And so the relationship comes into play. And this is why you can have a free diver who can hold their breath for 11 minutes statically, or you have you and me who hold our breath for 3 or 4 or 5 minutes, or you have general population who can hold their breath for less than a minute.
For sure. And so I just want to take one step back for anybody who's kind of new to the conversation. We're really talking about carbon dioxide as a mediator to allow more oxygen into the tissues at its simplest level. Now, I just know from working in private practice, the average person, they're sitting across from me, I'm taking their oxygen, maybe it's a 97, maybe it's a 96, and that's just them with an oximeter on their finger. All of a sudden they start to talk and they talk about all the things that are wrong with them. And I'm just watching that oximeter and it's starting to drop down to 92, 93. And this is just them at rest. So we start to do some breath work and I know that you've talked about this before. And I just say, take a breath in for me, just a nice slow inhale through the nose. And then I ask them to do the exhale and their inhale will be twice as long as their exhale. And I say, okay, now purposely try to exhale for a longer period of time. And they just can't do it. And this is something that people can test at home. Is that because their nervous system is so locked up and tense, or is it carbon dioxide and chemosensitivity-based receptor issue?
I would say the latter, in that sensitivity to CO2 has them locked up. And this is where our work started to really pivot years ago, when I started noticing that not everybody responded to the same breathing protocols in the same way. People were having very different reactions. Like if you had a high anxiety person and had them breath hold, that wasn't actually a good thing for them. That started to spin them out. right?
Yeah.
Like, so if you did like inhale, hold, exhale, hold, like a box breathing set, it didn't exactly do it for them. So we ended up backing those types of folks up to something that was just like a simple 3 count in, 3 count out, and just follow that pattern. And what happens as a result of following that pattern? So now you've got 1 breath every 6 seconds. Now you've got 12 breaths a minute. Right. So now we've got people slowed down. That slowing down has raised levels of CO2, which now vasodilates. So we start to get a calming effect. There is a reason why people used to tell people to breathe into a bag when they had a panic attack. The physiological consequences of that are more carbon dioxide back into the system, vasodilation, calming of the system. All of a sudden the nervous system starts to relent and let up. And so I look at it as like breath is the gateway to the nervous system, meaning it's probably the most powerful tool we have in grabbing a hold of that nervous system, whether we want to go up or whether we want to go down, right? And that's also tied into thinking and emotions, right? But
absolutely.
Yeah. So at any rate, yes.
So yeah, I mean, we talked about this before. Your physiology absolutely affects your psychology. So if you're dealing with low mood, if you're dealing with, well, even just neurotransmitter wise, if you're dealing with low dopamine, people are always trying to manipulate their neurotransmitters when it's far easier to manipulate your breathing than it is to manipulate neurotransmitters and start putting all sorts of different, amino acids in your body as precursors like L-tyrosine, when you just might need some sunlight in the morning or a light box if you're here like I am in Maine or Boston, as well as some breathing based techniques. So yeah, irritability, mood, just depression. Talk about just a little bit of the breath work, and it's tied to the breath because, again, people say, well, exercise is one of those things that helps with depression. Oh, there's no doubt about it. I mean, if you're not exercising, you have low mood or depression. But what's exercising forcing you to do? It's also forcing you to breathe and change that. So
it is. And see, this is actually a conversation one of my partners and I had yesterday on our start of our little podcast we're doing. But and this goes right back to that capacity thing. We are so enamored with something wrong with inside the system at this point that exercise is like the thing to do, when it's like we're looking at this through this narrow lens still. And what is happening as a result of exercise? What are the variables that are happening? Sure, we do need to move, but the foundation of that is that breathing rate, that respiration rate is changing dramatically as a result of that. Why is that happening? You can actually manipulate that sitting down and change that entire process just sitting down. There's a reason why monks sit and breathe for extended periods of time and pay attention to their thoughts and call it meditation, right? Like they find enlightenment in this way because they're actually controlling their physiology, which is then moving into the psychology. And we have a brief saying that is psychology just misunderstood physiology? And in a lot of cases, in my experience, that is simply the only problem, is that we're just misunderstanding what the physiological signs are. In fact, research has shown us that with people who deal with panic attacks, the signs for those panic attacks are showing up an hour or more before the person has the actual panic attack. Yet when they're having the panic attack, there is no clinical sign that anything is wrong with this person. And so the signaling becomes since the nervous system's tied to this, since our physiology is tied to this, our breathing is one of those things that we get a response from. And so when my breathing changes, that becomes the catalyst in understanding first principles, and fundamentals. So foundation. So, look, I spent years not even paying attention to this. I mean, I was the guy that went to yoga, 20 years ago and was doing it because I wanted to remain flexible for triathlon, right? Granted, there's a fundamental breath practice layered in there, and it's been there for roughly 5,000 years. And I didn't transfer that over into daily life or even performance, right? And nobody was doing that at the time. And then it became this like, wow, like I just got hit in the head with something, and it was a great idea. And thing to think about. So.
Well, it's almost like comparative to, you see people every January at the gym and they look no different than they did the year before. And that's fine if that's their goal, like no big deal, but nothing's improved. Like aerobic capacity hasn't improved, or their distance, or whatever it might be. And they're still on that treadmill. Well, it's the same thing with yoga. Like a lot of people don't get more flexible in yoga because they're missing the breath aspect to it. Meaning you could be a monk and meditate all day, and you'll most likely be able to do like a full split, because there's a change at a tissue level of pH as well, and just overall blood flow and oxygenation at the tissues that helps with that. And so that's the missing element. And I just think that there's a lot of work that's going to be happening over the next 5 years in terms of psychology and physiology and performance. That all comes back to the breath work. I think that there needs to be like better styles of implementation and who this is best for and how to work, and better haptic feedback devices. But I think it's getting there, because just like you said, I mean, I still believe, like, for sure, if you have low levels of magnesium, you're going to be more sympathetic nervous system dominant. If you like all the trauma, all these different things, but you could short circuit in a second a panic attack or an asthma attack or many of these different things, going back to your breath and just opening up the thoracic cavity and calming the central nervous system. So we already know that can happen. So it most likely is a physiological based event affecting your psychology to a far greater degree.
Yes. I mean, we're on the same page, and thanks to work by, your work, it's starting to accelerate. Well,
and I think that the work by, in Andrew Huberman, which he's becoming much more popular with eye movement-based techniques, which I'm looking into a little bit more myself. Okay, like how could I implement that into practice with people? And that might be complicated, but he's also looking into maybe during your talk therapy-based sessions, you're on a walk with that person instead, and you're doing the exact same thing. When I heard that, I'm like, oh, that's brilliant. I'm like, that could be one of like the foundational things that people are doing. And then what if you had malt tape on? So, because you can't think about everything at the same time. So you're now working on nasal breathing, and that could be a game changer. And I've just found that for myself, and I'd love to get your feedback. So I'm in Maine right now, Boston. I split my time between the two. It's freezing out. It's snowing literally right now. I do trail running for like 6 months of the year, because for about a decade in my life, from like 2000 and 2010, I gave up all aerobic based training because I said it's ridiculous. Anything I get from aerobic training, I can get from sprint based training. And I was just all about it. I was in more of like the natural bodybuilding world and performance, all those different things. And from an exterior point of view, I was getting better gains, but from the insides, I don't think I was in great shape, and flexibility, all those different things. So now I've gotten far more back to aerobic. It's probably like not 50% of my training, but let's say like 35, 40% of my training, maybe a little bit more. And my HRV's improved. I've made myself do nasal breathing, like everything improved with that. Now, the reason I'm getting to that, in my office, I have a Rogue Echo bike now that I've just been using for sprint-based training. And because I can't go out, can't do my trail running, my HRV has gone down, and my energy is about the same, but my relaxation-based state has gone down. Have you seen that at all, the tie between doing more anaerobic, which I'm doing now, versus aerobic?
Very much so. Very much.
I'd like to learn more and hear more about that, because I'm blaming it on a few different things. Because my sleep is exactly the same, but I'm also, and this is going to be part 2. Do you think sunlight plays a big role in aerobic as well as HRV metabolism?
I haven't really thought about the sunlight aspect, but I'm sure it does, since sunlight is probably one of the most important things that we have, especially from that D3, vitamin D standpoint. It affects just about everything. So, what I have noticed is people who become aerobically efficient respond to heat much easier than those who do not. And cold folks who are more anaerobic or more power-based end up responding to cold real well, right?
Meaning how? They're tolerant to it, or they improve
tolerant,
their HRV?
They are tolerant to one or the other at first, until those things switch. So moving more towards thinking about the training, like I was and am a big proponent of high-intensity training, but where it's kind of changed for me, because I literally I created a paradigm shift quite some time ago inside the endurance world by taking away, by saying we don't need to go out and suffer and beat ourselves up for these long durations of time. You can actually shorten those windows and couple this stuff with strength and conditioning and high intensity work. Mm-hmm. Where I've changed that thinking is how energy systems are developed. And this is where we've implemented something like a gearing system. So think of your breathing as gears, and gear 1 would be nasal only and an equal in and out, right? From there, it moves up to a little bit of a faster. So it's faster inhale on the nose only. Then it's fast nose in, fast nose out. Nose in, mouth out for gear 4. Mouth in, mouth out for gear 5. Very rarely are we touching that gear 5 in training anymore, even if it's short, hard work. Mm-hmm. And here's why. If I control that variable of carbon dioxide, I actually the system will have to regulate itself back to where it can manage that after a few bouts, right? So if I don't allow myself to go over a gear 3, let's say, I am staying far more aerobic, but I'm forcing that CO2 mechanism to play, making it feel very difficult, right? Mm-hmm. So where I've seen this is I've worked with a number of CrossFit athletes, a lot of them, like the best in the world, like Tia Claire Toomey, I've worked with for years. Rich Froning, I worked with for years. A lot of these world champions and people who were, big names in CrossFit and are big names in CrossFit, I've worked with. And the ones that get it actually apply more of the aerobic training to what they're doing, right? So what you're seeing. Then you start to see the problems with the people who don't. And this is why we started implementing the gearing, because if you actually put gearing on people, no matter what the work is, they will be forced to be in a specific energy place. So you could go do sprint intervals, but if I'm regulating your breathing to that, you're going to regulate back down after you've hit some anaerobic activity. You're going to come back because you can't open that mouth. Not supposed to open that mouth, right? And then it's like, well, no, I had to. Okay, so the next one, don't go that hard.
Right.
And learn where that aerobic threshold is. And that's what that is. And this is what we're teaching people now. And so what we originally did was a skill-based approach to endurance training. Where we've moved to is a gear system approach that is really skill-focused on all-around conditioning training. So looking at all of this stuff and saying, hey, where do you want to go? I mean, sure, go out on your run, but if you're supposed to be aerobic, keep your mouth shut. Well, I can't keep my mouth shut. Well, guess what? You're not as aerobic as you think you are.
Right. No, it's an important point because I had to dial it way back. So I was committed to nasal breathing only while running. I had read Chi Running, a decade ago, all these things. And I'm like, well, yeah, but it slows down my performance. So I'm not going to do it. But I went back, literally mouth taped, just made myself just say, no matter what, you don't get to open your mouth while you're, and I had to slow it way down. And my trail run, the hard part is the very first 50 yards is essentially straight uphill. So I was almost crawling for the 50 yards, but again, committed to that. And what I found is after about 3 to 5 minutes, it didn't happen right away. I was breathing very rapidly through my nose for those first 3 to 5 minutes. And then my body's like, okay, I got it. And it reset itself. And so when you're talking about this, and for anybody who's kind of like losing it a little bit right now, it's simply between like thinking of more of our traditional cardio and working with oxygen versus that lactic acid or glucose-based metabolism for when you're doing like strength training. But I've actually looked at it differently. And I know that you kind of think the same thing is my strength training now is all nasal breathing. And I refuse to do anything that causes me to do mouth breathing because it stimulates my sympathetic nervous system too much, and I am then too fatigued, not fatigued, but I'm more worn out the next day. And I believe the oxidative stress process is too much of my body. And I also think it's why people can't maintain Ironmans and CrossFit for life, because the oxidative stress just crushes them.
Yeah.
But again, I don't know. That's not founded in anything, but I've noticed my recovery much better.
And I'm sure you're pretty intuitive, and obviously you pay attention to a lot. You're a smart guy, and you have a practice. So you're working with people. How many people a day are you seeing? How much talking are you doing?
Oh, you are absolutely correct. So I talk for 4 hours a day of recording, and then probably another hour of meetings.
And so I would then say, I think you're spot on, dude, because why would you need to go in and squat or deadlift and start to mouth breathe when you've been really mouth breathing all day, and just regulate your lifting now to something that is keeping you a little bit more in those aerobic lines. Not that you're not going to hit some of that anaerobic stuff, even with your run. Like when you start off on anything, if I go stand up right now, there will be anaerobic activity that occurs metabolically because there's not enough oxygen right there present for the cells that need it for the demand that's happening. But it then starts to regulate, and that's why ventilation goes up, respiration rate goes up, right?
Yes.
But if I actually draw in a deeper breath, I'm pulling in more oxygen, and then I'm controlling the CO2 out. I'm actually forcing more of those the trillions of oxygen molecules in a single blood cell, right? To get out of that thing. And this is where, look, when we're talking about disease, we're talking about metabolic dysfunction.
Yeah,
pretty much at this point. The consensus is coming down to every major disease being some form of metabolic dysfunction. And although we should be going after nutrition, and that is a big problem in this, no doubt. Let's not silo that thing. Let's not silo the exercising, and let's not silo the breathing. But I'll tell you what, your ventilation is telling you everything that's going on underneath that hood. And the sooner that you can grab a hold and understand that, and you have just displayed that in what you told me about yourself. And so this is where my work comes in with people. When I work one-on-one with them, is I start to get them to understand how breathing affects them through their daily lives, when, how to respond versus react. Because that's exactly what's happening when people exercise. They think it's this thing where I need to react versus respond. What am I trying to get out of this? And how, we are so unique. We're so special that we are the only species that self-directs stress in order to create adaptations. Every other species is just playing a game of survival, right?
That's right.
And although you got killer whales, orcas that have learned and taught themselves how to do specific exercises in killing animals, like beaching themselves, they did that out of survival, right? We go and pick up weights and go for a run knowing that if I do this enough, it's going to create a better me, right? And so this is what I mean is self-directed adaptability. And at the foundation of this is breathing.
Yes.
At the foundation of everything we do is breathing, because if we don't move energy, we die. And so when there's metabolic dysfunction, I don't have the answers to how that sets off, whether it be cancer, whether it be, ALS, whether it be whatever it becomes. These dysfunctions start to happen. And this could be just an emotional thing. And this is what we're starting to see as well, as people who don't know how to regulate emotionally, and that internal working of suppression or aggression or whatever that's become, that has an effect on us internally, right? Yes. That comes out of our breath. That comes out of us metabolically. That comes out of how we move energy. There is a weight to emotion. And all of this is interconnected. And so when we deal with breathing, we get people to understand, just as you've described to me, Doc, hey, I feel like I'm a bit more stressed out the next day if I mouth breathe when I weightlift. Well, let me ask you a question. Do you talk a lot? And you're like, an astronomical amount. I said, you're probably on the right path.
Yes. No, and I just want to say, I don't, and for a second, I don't actually not believe that I'm in the anaerobic based zone, we'll call it.
No.
100% when I'm doing my sprints, I still am, but I'm nasal breathing just to be able to control my central nervous system or autonomic nervous system to a greater degree. That's it. And for me, as someone who's definitely sympathetic nervous system dominant during the day with the work that I do, I'm using a PEMF mat. I'm using, different things to say, okay, if I'm like the yin yang symbol, if I'm pushing this hard in this direction, I need to then pull back in the other. And I think that's important for people is to look at like, what do your scales look like? How balanced are you? And going back to, I think we have a good idea too about how these diseases are created. So more of my work is in the autonomic nervous system. And so I look at it as the neuroendoimmune system. So if our nervous system, the peripheral nervous system and everything, so like the peripheral nervous system is just my feedback loop. And then inside my body, I can do my thoughts, my digestion, whatever's going on. Okay, now we are what? We're upregulating norepinephrine or cortisol. And what are we downregulating? Well, we're downregulating then progesterone. We're downregulating maybe testosterone, DHEA in the long term, progesterone. Okay, well, what's happening now? Well, inflammation is increasing over the long term. In the short term, it's not. And inflammation is implicated in what? Well, 90%. I don't know what disease it's not, but the quote is 90% of all disease. So I would say, well, if breathing can then shift your nervous system back to the parasympathetic nervous system, would that then be probably a good idea? And I would say, yeah, it'd probably be a good idea. But the issue is, more than likely, other things need to follow. Because if you've been a decade, 2 decades, crushing your body, more sympathetic nervous system dominant, you're deficient in all sorts of minerals and electrolytes. And that's kind of where I'd like to shift next. Because unless you want to add to that, because
sir. I totally, we're on the same page. So
well, I'd like to know,
and make no point, make no mistake. I'm not one to say we shouldn't be using traditional medicine just because,
sure.
Ever, even though I'm somebody who's, I started a foundation for looking at non-pharmacological ways of managing stress and disease. That doesn't mean I'm anti-Western medicine.
Yes.
That means it needs to be used with something else and vice versa, right? Like it might.
Well, I essentially took an oath to never use pharmaceuticals in my profession because I'm a naturopath, board certified naturopath.
Of course.
But there's, like you just said, there's a time and place.
Hey man, there's going to be an emergency. My life is here because of Western medicine, no doubt. Like I raising my hand, like it happened. I would prefer not to be using because that's like, I want to be as natural. I want to be as in tune with my nature as possible.
And that's right. And pharmaceuticals are going to mask your nature. And so if you use them in the short term because it's life-saving, then absolutely 100%. I always tell people if your blood pressure's 200 over 130, you should probably be put on some medication temporarily so that you don't have a stroke. Like that's because we can't help you if you've had a stroke. Like, or Well,
let's couple that with some breathing exercises from Brian MacKenzie.
Absolutely, 100%. So let's talk a little bit about though, because I'm leaning towards at least a theory that some people have a difficulty with carbon dioxide tolerance because they have kidney dysregulatory issues that are not properly buffering the pH of their blood. And because of that, they're not able to balance oxygen within the cells. So they're constantly dealing with a suboptimal pH of the blood, meaning that instead of 7.356, they're more like 7.2. They hover. They're acceptable, but their body's constantly needing to buffer that and using up. What are your thoughts on that? And that's why some people kind of get stuck. Or do you think that, that's probably not to do with it?
Chicken or the egg, man. You're talking chicken or the egg right now. That was my very first thought when you brought that up. I tend to lean towards there is some sort of disturbance inside the system, whether it be an emotional one. And by that, like, look, a lot of people are emotional deniers. They're real good at hiding what they're not dealing with, right? But they're real good in certain areas and not in others. Like maybe they're real great in public or at work, but with their family, they're terrible at saying no to, right? And they'll basically cook themselves out for dealing with somebody else when they had no capacity to do so. Or you're just talking about somebody who's angry all the time and doesn't know how to manage stress at all, right?
Sure.
We all have places we could work on here. So I think that's kind of fundamental in this. And that like I just brought up earlier, that carries weight. And now, if it's somebody who is your chronic amateur exerciser, right, has to work out, has to get this run in, no matter what, this is emotional dysregulation. So this is something that's a problem. And so if I have stress that I haven't managed right, or that was new, like let's say there's a death in the family, and then all of a sudden work came up and there's all this work I had to do, but I had to get my run in. Was it advantageous to get my run in? Or did that send me over the cliff? Right. And we have and just try and see if you can fit something into this idea that I'm giving you, in that we all fall here at some point, right?
Well, it goes back to that total stress load. You know, like what you put on the body. And a death in the family or a breakup is a really big one. I see that as a trigger point in my practice for autoimmune issues. It was always there. Like it was getting there. Oh, and then boom, this happened. Fired from a job or whatever it might happen. Yes, correct. So going back to your original question, I tend to lean towards this process that's been occurring, and over breathing is a result of that throughout our day. Whether I'm a high performer, here's my type A's, you and me. Yes. I talk most of the day. Then I need to work out really hard because that's what makes me feel good and powerful. Right? Then I go home and might have a glass of wine every night. Oh, so, and then I try and work on my relationships, right? But that's not going real well either, right? So you have tied in here a lot of overbreathing. What happens from an overbreathing standpoint? The kidneys go on overload to make up for the loss of carbon dioxide by releasing bicarbonate into the system, which inevitably leaches the mineral and electrolytes out of the system. Yeah. So we see athletes who have osteoporosis, or we have cramping issues. Like I saw this for years and had and always thought it was just like this sweat issue. Yet we would address a sweat issue and they would still cramp. And then when I started looking at the mechanisms through the physiology of this stuff, it was like, holy crap, they're over breathing when they're running. Like they're literally just leaching it out through breathing. Like that's becoming the aspect of it. So I'm not right or wrong. Yeah. I'm just saying this is one of those aspects that very few people have looked at, and yet there's research dating back to 1949 showing this electrolyte imbalance. There's actually a researcher out there who directly went after the patents of the electrolyte loss from overbreathing, so that he created mineral compounds that you could give to people who were dealing with schizophrenia, dealing with psychosis, dealing with things that were inevitabilities of this process of occurrence. And I'm like, why is he going after this? Why does he have patents on this in 1992? And it's like you start looking back on research, you're like, holy, like this is literally what happens when we are overbreathing. And then you look at like the work of, Can I stop you there for one second? I want to actually just talk about that part because that was going to be my next question is I wonder if this person's using magnesium, sodium bicarb, and a potassium citrate and not the calcium, because the calcium is what's essentially being leached, and that creates the imbalances between calcium and sodium and calcium and magnesium. But my next part to that would be, because I don't know if that's true or not, have you tried with any of your experimentation using any kind of bicarb solution, sodium, magnesium, or potassium citrate to improve breath hold time or to improve nasal breathing or anything like that? Yes. Yeah. And what did it look like? Anything? Yeah. They can work, but the biggest change I saw was shutting my mouth. Yes. So that's the biggest one. I was a mild cramper at certain time frames after being out, like on my bike or running for periods of time. Like on occasion, I go do like 6-hour epic rides, things like that, like big, long stuff. And I haven't done it for a while. And in the past, I start to cramp up at specific points. And granted, there are a few mechanisms at play there.
meaning tissue not developed that far out for aerobic, function. So we've exhausted a lot of the anaerobic tissue, right? But since implementing all of this stuff in the last 4 years, it has been a rarity that I have ever cramped. It has been a fundamental change in the athletes that have been crampers in the past, that now they don't cramp when they're dealing with these things. So I would, your world is more playing with these bicarbonates, and they have their place, right? Like if you were to drink a sodium bicarbonate, quarter teaspoon once a day in some water, you might be changing the alkaline, the alkalinity of the system to a small degree, right? Getting that shift, which inevitably could help with the system in dropping and not creating this over-breathing compensatory shift. But that over-breathing compensatory shift is actually a more alkaline place. That's where things are getting off skewed with the over-breathers. Yeah. And so it's getting us back down.
That part is fairly confusing, because when you start to overbreathe and breathe more, you actually create a more alkaline solution in the blood. And, that's challenging, because most people would say, well, that's a good thing. Well, but again, not necessarily, right? Because then you're not able to drive the oxygen where it's needed the most.
Correct.
But I did cut you off. And where were you moving next after I asked about those alkaline solutions?
No, I felt that just changing my breathing and creating some breathing habits throughout the day have been the biggest game changer of all. And I think that holds more of a solution towards things than the supplementation of things. Even though I would say getting on some form of electrolyte solution, by and large, for the vast majority of the population, is probably a good thing.
Yeah, I think that people are imbalanced for sure. There's no doubt about it. What are some of the techniques? So, for one, we'll talk about a few of the techniques that you can do just during the day to improve your overall CO2 tolerance. But also, how do we get it to stick so that we start to see those results? Because people will be doing those things, and they'll message me, and they'll just say, well, I've been doing it and my HRV isn't improving, my biofeedback isn't improving, my whatever isn't improving. So let's talk about timelines, and then also like what makes the biggest difference, because people want the 80-20 rule, right? They want to say, okay, this 20% over here, well, that's going to drive 80% of my results. I'm perfectly fine with 80% out of the 100. So what does that look like?
So I typically will start people off by bookending their day with some breathing protocols. And we start, we have what's called a breath test or a CO2 tolerance test on our website. It's free to everybody. So if you go to shiftadapt.com and you click on breath work, you scroll down to breath calculator. You take the breath test. You do this max exhale test. It's just something we ripped off from the freediving world, who's been using it for years to set CO2 tables and breath work. You go through this test. You stick your number into the algorithm, and it'll pump out 3 different apnea protocols and 3 different cadence protocols. And by that, I mean, these are just sequences of breathing, right? You want to find out which protocol works for you that kind of makes you feel calm but alert. And this is a lot of the work I did with Dr. Huberman, was really understanding arousal states. And there's really only 2 that we want to be in. We want to be alert and calm, which is like you and I right now, right? And we want to be calm and feel like we can go to sleep, right? Because it's either asleep or dead after that. And then it's anxious, which is beyond the alert and calm, right? Like just too alert is like, So we want something that's going to kind of make us feel alert and calm in the morning. And you really want to start with kind of like a minimum of at least 5 minutes, if not more than that, just running through a simple protocol. And let's just say it's a box breathing set that makes you feel alert and calm. So you're following whatever your breath test was, it'll set you up for your own physiological reaction to CO2, right? So that exhale test is telling us how well you manage CO2 so that we can actually give you a breathing protocol that'll fit inside the schema of you,
Yes.
right? So a 4-4-4-4 might work for me, but may not work for you as well, right? And so let's just say I'm on a 4-4-4-4. I would do that for 5 to 10, if not longer, minutes in the morning. So I dedicate about a time to just starting my day with that. At the end of the day, we want something that's going to downshift us and make us feel really calm. So we'd go through those protocols, play around with them, and figure out which one makes us feel the most calm. And some of them are going to make you feel like anxious, like it's too much, or some of them aren't going to feel like they do anything. But you really want to tie those in and play with those. So we give you the options to play with those. We're actually developing an app right now that's going to do all of this for you.
That's great.
Yeah. But,
it'll have biofeedback in it. You'll be able to kind of see
that's great.
Yeah. So we're getting there. But this is all out there for you to just go and play with. And then you can do this in the morning and in the evening. So a minimum of 5 to 10 minutes in the morning, minimum of 5 to 10 minutes in the evening. Get yourself to downshift. And then for the next 4 weeks, nasal only breathing in everything you do, other than talking and eating.
Would you say that this could count as a form of meditation?
100%.
Okay.
Breathing, breath control is a form of meditation. It's a reason why it's at the foundation of every single, like you don't go to a, what's it called? Forgive me for forgetting. My mind draws a blank, but there's a great 10-day retreat that people do for a specific type of meditation practice. And it's just sitting. But the first three days of it is literally just paying attention to your breathing. Then you can stop paying attention to your breathing. It really, like most meditation practices have breathing at the foundation of them.
Well, it's the best way to look at it because when you're focused on your breath, you're not focused on all the thoughts in your head. So instead of just saying, don't think about anything, it's better just to focus on one thing, which is your breath. And so that's what I've always found. And so, because people are always told to meditate 10 minutes twice a day, 20 minutes twice a day, whatever it might be, 10 minutes twice a day. I mean, that's a game changer. Even 5 minutes. Like if you're not doing anything now and you do 5 minutes twice a day, just to center yourself, I think it can be, absolutely fantastic. So it's a great tip right there as well. Tell me, people always talking about different forms of breathing. Like Patrick is saying, listen, you should only be doing Buteyko-based breathing, which he didn't make up. It's just, you should be just doing low and slow. But, I did some of my internships over in India and Sri Lanka, and I did many different forms of yoga, and we did all different types of breathing. So I'm like, well, I've bet against Ayurveda a few times many years ago, and I've always been wrong because they only have 6,000 years of, practice and at least. So I'm pretty sure they know. I just don't know. Like I just haven't figured it out yet. So I'm assuming that different forms of breathing are also good at different times. Would you agree?
I think pranayama nailed it.
So you think
I don't think I think that there are so many books on pranayama and yoga out there and Ayurvedic work and what I literally like light on pranayama. If you go into that book, you will see almost all aspects of different breathing rhythms in there. And that in and of itself told us we were on the right path. Because we didn't go study that at first, right? We came to that after seeing what we saw and paying attention. And I don't think Buteyko was wrong. I think Buteyko developed a method. Wim Hof has developed a method.
Yes.
These are potent, powerful things. They are not cure-alls. And Patrick popularized the Buteyko method because the Buteyko method was almost an impossible thing to understand outside of Patrick McEwen's fundamental understanding of it and being able to communicate that. He comes from a camp called Buteyko. He is going to lean towards slow and low all day long. But the fact is once you get a hold of your breathing, that's really where your breathing goes when you're just sitting here listening to me right now, right?
Yes.
Like, but
100%.
to say that I'm not supposed to take a full inhale means you've never been in a fight. And that's not realistic. And I don't mean just a physical fight. What if you've never been in an emotional fight with your spouse or like somebody in your family? Like, come on, like what's realistic and what isn't? And if we weren't designed to take a full inhale or exhale fully, why can we? Why do we? And why is this bag of elasticity that sits underneath my rib cage able to stretch across a tennis court if I were to just dissect it? Like, it's so elastic. It's a, and it's more sensitive at those end ranges to diffusion. Yes. Weird. So, but that doesn't also mean I need to be going all day long. Right.
Yeah, it's interesting to find the balance, because I agree the set point should be buteyko breathing. I agree with Patrick on that. However, I just feel like from a fundamental physiological perspective, you need to get into the deep lower lobes of the lungs, stretch, and get rid of all of the junk, for bad of a lack of terminology, from the bottom lobes of the lungs. And so I think that's important. I think it's powerful. And I'll relate it back to actually a post I saw you post. Is like, I'd prefer to be the guy, I don't even know when you wrote this, but I was like, hey, I'm on the same exact page. I prefer to be the guy who can eat a donut once a week and be totally fine than the guy who, breaks out in a rash or hives or whatever it is they said. Like, you want to be able to go to this breathing zone, go to this breathing zone. Yeah. And then just move right back to your set point, your homeostasis right away. So that's how I see it. You need to be able to use them all.
Yeah. And I mean, look, like it's so funny because we all get siloed into these places at times, right? And I can't tell you how many like DMs and how many conversations I have with people about like, well, Wim Hof does this whole hyperventilation thing. And it's like, yeah, there's a time and a place for everything. And it's actually can provide some very needed deep relief to the nervous system if done appropriately. But if you're somebody who's dealing with anxiety or has cardiac problems, I'd probably suggest staying away from Wim Hof now, because your physiology is telling you that if I go into a sympathetic uptick by hyperventilation, I constrict blood vessels. If I'm a cardiac patient with problems, I probably don't want to be doing something like that.
It's funny, because people used to get so mad at me when Wim Hof first came out, and I didn't know anything about Wim Hof, but I said, hey, if you do this, you're going to be in more of a sympathetic nervous system state. You're going to produce more adrenaline, norepinephrine, most likely more cortisol. This, and this is going to happen. I don't think it's such a good idea. Now, the reason why I've made a little bit of a turn is, and I still don't believe it's being taught properly, is if you do the Wim Hof method and you understand the relaxation response most people don't, but you can get from it, then it takes you to an even deeper place of parasympathetic nervous system. Now, if you can do that, it's a game changer, but they don't teach that.
That is its intention. And that is what Wim is capable of doing and what Brian
Wim is. We need to teach that.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, look, I spent I spent a lot of time with Wim. I was very close to Wim at times. He's very deep into this stuff. And yes, I do think that there is like, look, and this is what I was alluding to with Patrick. He sits in the buteyko camp. He's going to need to lean towards buteyko being this thing. But he's a smart man and he understands principles. And this is where the difficulty becomes is it's like Wim's a pretty smart guy too. He created something, but it's not new. This is a form of Tumo. This is an ancient form of Tumo. It's one of the versions of Tumo. And there's been aspects of this taught in yoga with stern warning.
Yeah, by the way, very experienced monks who have like decades of training then got to train in like Tumo. It's like, it wasn't just your average person.
Correct. And I mean, look, Brian MacKenzie's jumped into a lot of this stuff, into the deep end to just experiment. But he's come back to saying that the foundation of all breath work should be understanding the difference between nose and mouth breathing. Mm-hmm. That is it. That is the fundamental. Now, can you sit and follow a pattern for 5-10 minutes in the morning, 5-10 minutes at night? Mm. Can you also just shut your mouth for the next month and anything you do, including the exercise that you participate in for the next month? And professional athlete barring, every human being should be able to do that and if their ego's getting stripped, then therein we have found where maybe the issue might be. Mm. From an emotional standpoint, there is an attachment to something that we have an opportunity to learn from. What happens in the next month if I can let go of this part of my ego and my attachment to this, and the outcome of this being my performance, and seeing what happens in a month and what will happen to my performance after that. Mm-hmm. For me, and for many of the people that I've worked with, they got way more efficient and saw a capacity down the road that they didn't realize they could have. And I've had CrossFit athletes who could only nasal breathe at like a 140 heart rate on an assault bike, and in a month were at a 170 heart rate and felt like they could go forever.
Wow. Yeah, that's impressive.
That is a very big difference. I'm not saying that's going to happen to everybody, but I can say that with what we've seen from a metabolic perspective, it is a game-changing thing that is occurring for a lot of people. And it's so game-changing that it's basically at the foundation of what we're teaching now.
And would you say, so, you know, we have stayed on the topic of breath work again, like it's just, this is the foundation. I mean, if you want to get better at anything, it has to come back to that energy systems of the body, et cetera, mood, irritability. But what about, are there other factors for heart rate variability? Meaning a lot of people I work with, they want to improve heart rate variability as a measurement. Yeah, maybe it's competitive for sure, but as a measurement for overall health, meaning if your heart rate variability is dropping, there could be reasons for that, recovery, et cetera. You're getting sick, but you're most likely not as healthy. And from the bottom, we'll just go with one standard. Your body's not as able to adapt to stress. You are not able to handle stress in your life. So is breathing really the number one thing you can do to improve heart rate variability, multi-taping at night, et cetera, or are there other modalities we can add into this?
I think breathing is probably, breathing is the most powerful tool we've got to grab a hold of our nervous system that we've got. That doesn't mean it's the only tool. There are plenty of tools, exercise being one of those, and variance in that exercise becomes critical as well too, right? Like, hey, yeah, I got
heart rate variance or
no, like training variance. Like, am I picking heavy things up? Am I doing long duration things, or am I just fitting myself into a box into one thing, right? And for the vast majority of us, we're not professional athletes who are needing to specialize, right? So I think light exposure is critical. In the morning, in the evening, that is fundamental. I think some sort of idea around, like, look, yoga, there's a reason why it's the oldest movement practice that we know of. And it just so happens learning how to inhale fully and exhale fully through positions lends itself to understanding what flexibility or mobility might really truly mean. Meaning, can I take a full breath of air in this position, or am I going
right?
And if I'm doing that, well, you should probably back off to where you can and move into something fully, right?
Yes.
And so I think we have to look at movement from that perspective, right? So this is where exercise movement comes into play. Emotionally speaking, I really think breathing's biggest thing that has given me is my ability to respond versus react. I will not sit here and play like I don't have I don't deal with a lot of sometimes. I can deal with sleepless nights. I can deal with a lot of different things. I can fundamentally tell you the difference between how I manage that stuff now versus how I used to is 360. Like, if I'm up or if I have had a night's sleep, I know pretty well the next day what I can do and what I can't. And that's based on And what it comes back to is my breathing.
And not getting down on yourself, right? Like it's like, okay, yeah, I didn't sleep that night. Okay. Like it's managing your emotions.
Or maybe a couple nights in a row, like I get myself caught into a tizzy. Like if I start to go into a tailspin as a result of that, that's me reacting.
Yes.
Versus responding and going, oh, this is an interesting opportunity to learn from. What have I been doing? It's been getting here. Oh my God, I can't believe I'm doing, oh, there I go, right? Tail spinning again. I'm catching myself in the reactive nature, right? So I then start to know how much I can take on. And I've been so good at that. I'm somebody who used to get colds probably every 3 to 6 months. Mm-hmm. I might get a cold once every year and a half or so now, right? I learn to respond to what it is based on how much stress I've taken on because I am very keen and aware of my breathing. And I'm parlaying this to your heart rate variability right now.
Yes.
What we've seen is that CO2 tolerance is, and this is speculative, but so our theory right now in watching and observing for a number of us is that CO2 tolerance is about 24 hours ahead of heart rate variability.
Interesting. Okay.
So
yeah,
my breathing rate is changing significantly in some aspect. So if my heart rate variability is going to be real low on a specific day, you're going to catch that through your breathing probably in that 24-hour period. And what would be what's so easy about what we've talked about is if you go in and do that CO2 tolerance test and you get some breathing rhythms that work for you for 5 or 10 minutes, well, let's just say you showed up that morning to go do your breathing rhythm and you couldn't do it because it was too difficult. Guess what? CO2 tolerance is off. Yes. So there's a shift in something that's happening. Or if I've noticed I went out on my run or I went to go work out, and I started needing to breathe heavier sooner, or I felt like I needed to mouth breathe, doing something I could normally nasal breathe. Mm-hmm. Guess what? CO2 tolerance is off. This is that suffocation alarm system that we all have that can be wired up into how we panic or how we set up our emotional system as well. And so when we start to dovetail or start to fall off of a cliff from an emotional standpoint, you're now suppressing your ability to tolerate carbon dioxide. It's not that it's diminishing. It's just, our stress levels have gone up, right? So it's suppressed our ability to handle normal loads. Mm-hmm. And so this is where something like exercise can feel better. Going on a walk can feel better, and just shutting your mouth. It's because you're now forcing yourself to get more aerobically inclined, right? Getting out of your head, going for a walk, shutting your mouth, or just going in and doing a breath practice and regulating oneself. And this is actually where something like a Wim Hof technique or a up-regulation technique can have a profound impact, because what does that do? It alters the pH instantaneously, because we're inducing, we are consciously inducing a hyperventilation technique in order to create a result.
Yes.
I'm not just going in to do holotropic breathing per se, where I'm going to be for an hour, but I go in and do 20 or 30 breaths, like, or breath of fire type thing.
Yes.
Until I've shifted that pH. And all of a sudden I go in and I can calm myself in getting that parasympathetic whack-a-mole through that process. It may not be for everybody, because it may set off triggers for those of us that are more anxious. And this is what we need to pay attention to. But for those of us that aren't, it may do us wonders in going in and for 20, 30 breaths, and then sitting in it and allowing that system to drop out and reset itself, and then going, oh, wow. And then maybe going into some slow controlled breathing or a walk and resetting that system, and then going, hey, I can go for a run tomorrow.
Yeah, I know, that's amazing. I mean, that's great advice. And that's when I actually, because I'm not adverse to Tumo or Wim Hof breathing, but it's like, okay, that's when to use it. And when I'm doing it, I actually, on my exhale, I'm consciously thinking about releasing the tension from my body. So it's in, out, in and then just get rid of that. And then a lot of people don't follow it with that breath hold and then that little recovery breath afterwards. And I think that those are game changers as well.
That's really important from a physiological aspect. And you and I have talked a lot about the physiology on it, but it's like, look, there's a reason why that breath hold's happening, a very good one. That breath hold is happening on an exhale.
Yes.
Because I have hyperventilated, I've blown off all that carbon dioxide. That in turn has stacked that red blood cell with oxygen. Mm-hmm. That red blood cell, that oxygen is not bioavailable though. That's why your pulse ox is at a 100 or 99.
Yeah.
That means it's not being used, right? Yeah. Now, if I hold on an exhale, what happens? Carbon dioxide starts to raise in the system and I'm not allowing it to exit. Mm-hmm. So it's building in the system and all of a sudden, all that oxygen is getting knocked off at a rapid rate. But this is also why you're not supposed to do this type of stuff in water.
Yes.
Is because what it's doing at a more rapid rate is it's shortening your time period to passing out with low oxygen because it's using up all that oxygen so quickly. And that is where when you feel the urge to breathe, you inhale and breathe, hold for a brief time, maybe 10 seconds, and all of a sudden you get this whoosh, and that is where the system has reset itself because you've now regulated the system, but the pH of the system is now shifted a little more alkaline. And this is why you're going to feel a little better because there's less inflammation in the system at this point.
Absolutely. Yeah. You get the decrease in inflammation from natural cortisol production. You get the decrease from that partial alkalosis. And so they can be powerful techniques, but these are legitimate techniques and people unfortunately don't have the full story and they have passed out in water and even just a cold tub. And died. Yeah. And that's the thing is like, especially
because you can hold your breath longer than you normally can. And why is that? You've removed the mechanism, like I brought up earlier. Carbon dioxide is the trigger for breathe, not oxygen. There's so very little in the system dedicated to oxygen sensing that it prepares you for death when it's too low. That's why you get woozy and pass out when oxygen is low, your system saying, oh, okay, fine, we're going to knock you out. You're going to die. And then what we'll do is turn your breathing system on while you're out. And that's where shallow water or drowning occurs.
Yeah. So these, I'll definitely link up some videos today. What I'd like to do now is to share with people best first steps if this is brand new to them and what they should look for then as step 2, step 3 to be able to walk up that ladder. And you have so many programs and different ways to teach people. Maybe there's favorite videos. We talked about shiftadapt.com. What are the first 2-3 steps that people should be taking?
I think getting a grasp on the difference between nasal and mouth breathing. How much mouth breathing are you doing out of a day? Can they catch themselves breathing out of their mouths when it's not necessary? And if I'm going to work out, is it necessary every time I work out? If I'm mouth breathing every time I work out, I can tell you right now, we have a deficiency. Like we need to understand that there are some real metabolic implications for that, right? Granted, maybe they don't show up for 10 or 20 years. But I can tell you from a professional athlete standpoint, they will show up in 3 to 6 or something like right in that range, right? That being said, that is the foundation. Then it's really just being able to sit for 5 or 10 minutes each day at the bookends and regulating my nervous system to begin and to end. Then it's fundamentally, can I just, for the next month, nose breathe in everything I do other than eating and talking? So it goes back to that aspect of the difference between what is necessary. So what the difference between nasal and mouth breathing, we should see, if you have not applied any of this, you should see a lot of change in the next 4 weeks. Then it's We can start talking about gears and training. We can start talking about more advanced exercises, things that we can implement into a lot of this stuff, which is all on our website. And so for your subscribers, it's we have a subscription, or the people who are listening to you, we have a subscription where we put all of our webinars that are an in-depth look at kind of everything I've been talking with you about. So we've got a tremendous amount of information and from an educational standpoint on there. But what we also have is kind of a look into how we train. So how we exercise, what we're doing, and how we're applying this breathing concept to that. We also have daily breath work, where there is actual breath work for beginners, intermediate, and advanced practitioners to actually go in. If you don't want to think and don't want to go through all of this, perfectly fine. Go and follow along. We will guide you through that process to getting a basic understanding of all of this stuff and to where you can implement it. We're more or less taking, there used to be a saying that you can't meditate your way through plowing a field. But what if you bring the meditation to that field? And this is what we're actually doing is we're bringing the meditation aspect into human performance and bringing a side to this that brings more awareness, because I believe that awareness is at the heart of all of this. And you cannot be fully aware, right, all the time. But which only means we can continue to be a little more aware of things every day. And so the more aware I am of what's going on with me, especially inside, the more in tune I am, the less I need to see of my health practitioners, the happier everybody is as a result of that, right?
Yes.
So there is no greater thing or freedom than being aware. And I think breathing is that gateway into that freedom of being responsive to what's going on under the hood.
It's fantastic. Yeah, absolutely. And I agree. This is about overall health and happiness and awareness and all of those things coming together. And it pours into every aspect of your life. So can't recommend it enough. Brian, where can people connect with you online as well? Because I know you do some pretty fantastic posts on Instagram, which are really informative as well. Not just what you eat for lunch.
Appreciate it. Yeah, that's only on occasion. My Instagram is @_Brian MacKenzie, but we have our website, my business's website, which is shiftadapt.com. So my business is Shift. They can also go if they want to do a consult or look into the mentorship stuff that we do. I do. That is on brianmackenzie.com. So those are the easiest places to find me. That's where I'm most active with everything that we're doing.
Excellent. I'm going to link all of those up today on the show notes.
And if you're interested in research, which look, if you don't want to buy into anything I've said, perfectly fine. We've got a list of research that we've compiled that we've put on to the Health and Human Performance Foundation, which is hhpf-foundation.org. We are also running research. We're involved in research. We're launching a kids program called Breathe for Teens, because we believe this needs to be implemented for kids, because we need functioning adults and we're not giving them the tools. And we think this is a fundamental tool. So anyway, there's my. That's
fantastic. Well, people will have some homework to do. I'm going to link all these up for sure.
Awesome.
Any parting words? I know we've covered so much today. I mean, the interview really has been fantastic. This is, I had what I wanted to cover with you, and then we went over today was what I felt would be the most benefit. And I really, truly hope people did get a lot out of this, which I have no doubt. This is probably a 2-3 time listen for many people to go back, be like, okay, where did I start now? Okay, I'm looking at this through a different lens. And I'll just mention that's where I've been with Ayurvedic medicine. I mean, I studied that previously. I did internships in Ayurvedic medicine, really moved more towards orthomolecular bioregulatory medicine, have come back to Ayurvedic medicine with a different mindset and different outlook. And I'm like, oh, wow. I'm like, this is so much more in depth than I ever thought.
Yeah.
And it's interviews like this too, that you just you can listen to this a year later and be like, oh, I'm in a different spot. I get it. I know what they're saying. So
yeah. Do you know Peter Crone?
Don't believe that I do.
You'd like him. He's an Ayurvedic guy, but he does a lot of he calls himself the mind architect. Fantastic guy. If you want me to connect you, just telling me, but go look into them. Go see them on Instagram. You'll like them.
I'll have to check that out. Really great chatting with you today. And I'm going to link up, again, everything where people can find you. Appreciate your time, and hopefully we can have you back on for a part 2 in the future.
Thank you. And I appreciate the work you're doing too. So thanks a lot.
Thank you. Before you go, I'd like to share with you what we have going on over at Equalife. Equalife is the equivalent to my private practice that has now been brought online and is virtual to be able to greater serve people all throughout the world. We literally ship at-home lab kits and protocols to over 25 different countries, and we've been doing that for many years. So what I'd like to do is share with you right now a special offer over at equa.life. That's our website, equi.life. And it truly embodies, as I said, our private functional medicine and integrative health practice. So what we are offering right now are the same exact labs we use inside of the private practice. And that is, to you, it's essentially open sourced so that you can find your own levels of your vitamins, whether you need more or less, minerals, more or less, heavy metals, whether you need to be doing a heavy metal detox. We can look at gut function as the overgrowth of bacteria or yeast or parasites, H. pylori. We can look at your hormone levels to see if you're balanced in terms of estrogen and progesterone, testosterone levels, DHEA, that nice anti-aging hormone. We can look at your cortisol levels. We can look at that cortisol to see if you have high or low energy. We can look at your thyroid and so much more, like food sensitivities, mitochondrial function, detox function, environmental toxins, you name it. If you don't know about these labs, or if you've been thinking about running a lab, I would highly recommend you and your family head on over to equa.life/labs. Right now, while supplies last for each lab, we are offering $100 off every single lab. That means all single labs are $100 off, plus you're also getting a 30-minute health coaching call with that, so that we can not just run the lab, but actually read the results to you, let you know exactly what they mean and what you can do to go about rebalancing your body. There's really nothing else like it in the world. There's honestly not, because you would have to search out a functional medicine doctor or integrative health practitioner in your area, which of course you're always welcome to do. We are not against that by any means, but we want to make this process easy for you, your family, your loved ones. So right now, save $100 off all single labs that also come with that complimentary 30-minute health coaching call as well, to read your labs and get a plan that has been customized just for you. The website, once again, is equa.life, and you can go to equa.life/labs if you'd like to go directly there. Take care, everyone, and of course, you can always email us at support@equa.life with any questions.